So we're here talking about the world of financial services in 2020 and what's the future going forward. I should say that, my bias is always, I come out of the personal finance world, so my bias is always talking about retirement and brokers and all of that sort of stuff. But luckily for everybody here, we have this amazing panel who can also talk about the bigger picture of the banks and Dodd-Frank and the economy and all the rest. So without further ado, I just real quickly, we have Amanda Fisher, who's a former congressional chief of staff, and I don't have your current title with me right now, so I'm sorry.
No one does. It's okay.
Ready to announce you.
Greg Gilzenis, is that how you say it? Greg? Gilzenis, who's from the Center for American Progress. Linda, next to him is Linda Jun. At Americans for Financial Reform, and Jennifer Taub at the Vermont Law School. Graham at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I'm doing really well this morning, everybody. You can tell I got about 4 hours of sleep right there. So anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to start by plunging in and starting with my first question, which is, which somebody said on our prep call the other day, which really fascinated me because it hadn't even occurred to me, which is, 10 years ago, we're a little bit 10 years past the crisis now. 10 years ago, all people could do was talk about Wall Street. Now we talk about billionaires, but the subject of Wall Street doesn't come up that nobody's even mentioned it in a Democratic debate. What happened? And who wants... Graham, you go first because I think it was you who might have mentioned it. And also I did forget you.
Great. Sure. I think a few things and acknowledging that this is just my perspective and my experience. And I don't necessarily, I'm not totally in tune with everybody in the country, but I also want to thank Capital Forum and all the groups that hosted this. This is a really great conversation and a really important one. I think a couple of things. One is just general fatigue. There have, at least in the Democratic Party, there have been so many fights over the last decade about what kind of Wall Street we want to see that are ugly. They highlight divisions within the party itself. It's not an easy way of saying what we're for and what Republicans are for. There's not a good contrast to draw there. So there's just a lot of people who don't want to talk about it because it raises a lot of those issues. I think the language is really esoteric. People don't understand things like what derivatives and swaps are. They don't necessarily know what a capital rule is or does. And purposefully so, the financial industry uses language that makes it harder for the ordinary person to engage. So they don't really know what we're talking about when we're talking about a lot of these issues. I just think for the average American, I think there's also still a lot of pain there. And they probably don't want to talk about it either because it brings up things like that lost job that they were on a particular career path 10 years ago, and then they lost their job, then they lost their home, and then they had to move. And so even for ordinary folks, it might be a little painful to think about what it was like. And they move past it, and they're not totally over it. And we see that from all the anger and why people are looking for more populism in their candidates, but they still haven't forgotten it deep down, and they may not want to go there.
Okay. Somebody else? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, back in 2009 when the Obama administration was kind of on the road, can you hear me? Pitching the upcoming plan for the bailouts. And I remember that Ben Bernanke was at an online or a town hall forum on television, and he said, when the elephants fall down, all the grass gets crushed as well. And the problem right now is the grass, all of us, have forgotten. The economy has turned the corner for many, not for all, and there is now a focus instead of the banks being the villain. People can only keep one villain in mind, and now we've shifted entirely, or almost entirely, to Trump and the Republicans as the villain. And I'm going to hold myself accountable for that as well. We've got a lot happening right now, and when you have these sort of big threats to the actual constitutional order, to norms, people have kind of put that a bit aside. And so where people's pain is now, where they feel crushed, is crushed under student loan debt, crushed under medical debt. And so I think the language is really smart. Both Bernie and Elizabeth talking about, instead of talking about abstract villains, talking about how they can help people with that burden. So this student loan forgiveness or the idea of Medicare for all is touching on those issues. And unfortunately, the other piece, which is continuing the reform of Wall Street and preventing the crisis again, preventing extending loans to people who can't afford them, that's the stuff behind the scenes that's been rolled back under the Republican, Senate.
Right. Do you want to go ahead? Or,
Sure, yeah,
yes, go
I'll
ahead.
jump in. And just to add actually onto what Graham said, former Federal Reserve governor who was really in charge of developing and implementing the post-crisis regulatory framework at the Fed, Dan Tarullo, had a quote last summer that I think highlights what Graham said, and I think hits a nail on the head. What we've seen under the Trump administration is a series of non-headline grabbing, low-intensity deregulation. So this stuff, when you add it together, it adds up to a comprehensive rollback of the 2007-2008 post-crisis framework. But the problem is, when you're talking about something like inter-affiliate margin or the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio, you lose people. And like Graham said, that's by design. Industry creates that complexity as a barrier to entry so people can't participate in that process. So I think that's part of the reason why, we haven't seen it, that added to the fact that memories are short. Maybe people don't want to go sort of back there in their mind. But I'd also argue that perhaps it is in the election, it is being discussed amidst other economic topics, that it's actually hidden. That folks in the antitrust community, and when we're talking about sort of the rigged economy as a whole and reforming corporate America, so think Senator Warren's Accountable Capitalism Act, that's actually tapping into the same thing. It's just broadening the conversation to our entire economy, the entire corporate sector, and not just on the financial sector.
Okay, go ahead, Linda.
I was also, can you hear me? I was also going to add, I think the reality is that people are tired, but there's also this belief, I think, for the regular person that I think there's a deep-seated belief or hope that things were so messed up in 2008 that I think the deregulation is, again, technical. And if you're not someone in this room or our friends, like they don't really understand what this stuff means. But I think there's also a desire and a hope to believe that the government and even financial institutions wouldn't let anything like this happen again. Like that this was so bad that there would be this idea that like certainly our government and our institutions would be smarter than that. And I think, and that coupled with it's all technical, it's all complicated, and there should now certainly be a set of experts who are looking at this all the time. I think that is like, people probably wouldn't put all of that together, but I think that's a sentiment that's in the background for a lot of people's minds. And so I think that's like a really important thing for all of us in this room to continue to think about, is how to make sure that people get into their consciousness that medical debt and student loan debt and these derivatives and swaps and weird words that most people are not familiar with are actually all connected in a giant rigged system, is what we all know. I know at Americans for Financial Reform, we've been working a lot on the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, for example, and private equity is a really good example of private equity is confusing. Hedge funds are confusing. These are weird words of big places and institutions with lots of money, right? If you're an average person, probably you sort of know what equity is, maybe, and that's a different word to you as, say, a single homeowner than it is to private equity, right, and funds. But private equity is wreaking havoc all over the place, right? I mean, beloved grocery stores, beloved stores, and places you used to shop, homes where you live, your neighborhood, and it's wreaking havoc all over the place, right? And that's just one example of how there's a lot of educating to do as far as how all of those pieces are connected and how it's affecting our own lives as regular people.
Right. And I want to throw, before you go, Amanda, I want to throw another piece, which is, 10 years ago, we had too big to fail. We now have even bigger than too big to fail. The other thing we now have is people talk about billionaires all the time. How does that factor in, and how does that shift those two things? How does that shift the regulatory world in a way, and the congressional, how we think about it?
I mean, I think as politicians, you need to be a storyteller. So having a villain is essential. And I think the more specific the villain, the more successful that can be. So in terms of talking about Wall Street or billionaires, I don't see a huge differentiation there. And I think people increasingly see Wall Street and financialization as connected to the real problems in their lives. Prescription drug prices, why their grocery store is closing. So I think that conversation, whether it's Wall Street banks or billionaires, I don't see a large differentiation.
Do you think, though, that it changes, and somebody else can answer too, by the way, that it sort of changes what we talk about in terms of the focus and what solutions we would propose? That it moves from regulatory to tax, say? Or am I overthinking this?
I don't think you're overthinking this, and I just want to I want to answer your question and draw on what we've been talking about, which is simplifying what we're talking about is important. I think the other day, one of the treasured moments was when a journalist from Good Morning America, I don't know if anyone saw this, was trying to get people to understand wealth inequality and income inequality. And he set himself up in a mall and had a bunch of, I think it was pumpkin pie, and asked people to divide the pie among various segments of society. And everyone was struck by how the pie actually got divided up. Things like that are the ways in which we can first let people come to the knowledge on their own and say, well, is this the society we want to live in? Is this the outcomes we want, and how do we get here? And I think this question of billionaires, it's a very complicated one. There was a big, I think that it's a danger to treat every person who is a billionaire as an oligarch. This was a debate we had, someone had on cable news recently. In other words, it's perfectly fine to say that there are some people who come into their money through perfectly legal means, even if the system is rigged to favor them, and to still at the same time say that's not an outcome that's healthy in our society, and we want to ask them to pay, for example, like Elizabeth Warren says, 2 cents. Right? A wealth tax. There's nothing wrong with saying you're not a bad person. And in fact, maybe you are super special because you have the ability and you've had the opportunity to succeed, but we still need you to give that back because we need public funds to support everyone else's chance. I think that's one category. There's a separate thing that we need to look honestly at the ways in which the way we fund businesses sometimes lets people become wealthy billionaire criminals. We can look at and I should be careful, alleged criminals. Elizabeth Holmes, who's been, charged with various forms of fraud, ran Theranos and somehow built a company on, a foundation of lies, fake blood results, and fawning funders to a $9 billion market valuation. Or look at Adam Newman, not accused of any crimes, at WeWork, who trashed his company and walked away with $1.7 billion. Okay, so there's something actually wrong with a system that creates some billionaires who are making their money by exploiting our vulnerabilities for greed, exploiting people's sense of truth. And there are others who may have earned it, and this gets to your tax question, may have earned it totally on the up and up. It doesn't kind of matter. When we have those huge concentrations of wealth and we don't have enough public funding, all of the rest of us suffer.
Graham, do you want to go?
Yeah. Yes, please. Thanks. I think an interesting dynamic in the debate around billionaires is the number of times you see somebody's name printed in a paper describing them as a billionaire, and you're like, I've never heard of this person. How does some random real estate investor become one of the top billionaires in this country? So focusing on things like a wealth tax and targeting billionaires gets at one aspect of this, which is that they have accumulated so much wealth, but it doesn't get at how they actually got there in the first place. Oftentimes it is actually through finance in the financial sector. So it's fine to have a conversation about reallocating that wealth, but we also need to talk about how they got it there in the first place, and that is the extractive financial system. That is the financialization that Amanda talked about. And I worry that sometimes that might get lost if someone doesn't actually draw that straight line from that predatory business model to then the accumulation of massive wealth.
Right. I mean, and how do we get around that? Because I think if you I write for newspapers, right? And Billionaires is like something that grabs the public, right? Like this is, you write, regulatory reform, 12 people click on it. You write Billionaire, a lot more people click on it. Does anyone have a sense of how you could get around that to reach out to the public more and get them to engage?
I mean, I was going to jump in before that, and I think this is still answers that to a certain degree too. Is I think people don't realize there's this idea of a benevolent billionaire, and I think there's some. I mean, I think now as things move forward and people are being more exposed to realities, I think it's hopefully becoming less so. But there's this idea that you could be rich and kind, and I think it's not untrue. I mean, as Jennifer just said, there are plenty of people who may think that, but there's the whole rigged system thing. I think the flip side of that, and what might also get people's attention, is how much people get away with, and like to just continue to shine more and more light on that, right? Is the system lets certain people accumulate a ridiculous amount of wealth, like, and how does that happen, and who's being left behind in that, even if it's all legal and the system allows it. And that's, I think, where we need to focus, is the system is allowing this. They're not, yes, they have fancy lawyers they've paid a lot of money to, but there's a system set up for them to exploit in that way. And systems aren't exciting if you talk about them like that, and regulatory, that word, snooze, right, for everyone. But I think it's just like that framework of who's getting away with what, and getting away with not necessarily in just like a legal criminal sense, but just getting away with taking all like more, I don't know if I want to say more than their share, but just a ridiculous amount of stuff. And on the other hand, who's not getting access to any of it, or even a chance to play in the game. And I think those types of metaphors would continue. And I think people are already doing this, but to do more of it.
Amanda, do you have thoughts? Yeah.
Further on this topic? No, I think.
Okay.
That's pretty well covered.
Okay. So I want to move on, and unless somebody else has anything to say, I want to move on and say something. Last year, not last year, it's 2018 now. Dodd-Frank was somewhat revamped. And one of the issues was that a number of Democrats went along with this. Can we talk about this tension for a moment in the party in terms of finance versus, I guess, supporting finance versus supporting finance as it is, let me put it that way, versus, trying to revamp it somewhat. And how does this sort of end up causing, does it help the populist cause? Does it increase populism? And who wants to go ahead?
I feel like Greg should just read his Twitter feed from 2018.
There are a lot of Democratic senators that were not pleased with me during that period. But, I think it does both in a sense. Right. I think it it undercuts the message that, we're sort of one party moving sort of together in one direction. Not that, anyone had that illusion before, but it makes that abundantly clear that there are divisions in the party. So in that way, I think it helps clarify things. There were 17 Senate Democrats that voted for that bill, which deregulated a whole host of large regional banks up to $250 billion in assets, and then had some other goodies in there for banks even larger than that. Sitting there 8 years after the financial crisis, when so many Americans still haven't recovered financially, let alone they'll never recover psychologically. Those scars will stay, with people forever. A kid thrown out of their home, never going to get over that. It's going to stay with them forever. So the idea that 8 years later, when bank profits were at an all-time high, we would decide to roll back key elements of Dodd-Frank that have yet to been tested, haven't had a financial crisis since, so don't know how they're going to work. I think it sort of shows who those Democrats were willing to fight for. And thankfully, the majority of Senate Democrats voted against it. And then even more House Democrats voted against it as a percentage of the caucus. So I think it was a good fight for the party to have in order to clarify where people stood and show the momentum and the energy that's still there on these issues when they are put front and center. And so hopefully it'll also inform policy going forward, and that some of those members touched the stove, so to speak, and saw the public backlash to that and won't make that mistake again.
Go ahead, Jen.
In those debates, what troubled me the most was that the justification those who were voting for the rollback gave was, these are small regional banks, right? Okay, but we're talking about in terms of the customer service protections, these were banks with assets of anywhere above $10 billion no longer had to be as concerned about ability to repay. And the problem is this forgets history. It doesn't just forget 2008, it forgets the savings and loan crisis where it was a lot of small savings and loans across the country, a lot in Texas and California, who were acting in concert in response to the Carter and then mostly Reagan era deregulation. And so, this inability to look to the history or unwillingness to look to the history and what actually hurts consumers and causes crises bother me.
Well, and I'd also add, I mean, as a customer, as a consumer, right? Whether you live in rural America or you live in New York City, and whether you bank with Chase or Wells Fargo or whatever your local bank is, there should be the same amount of protections for you. And if your bank hurts you or does something with your money that they shouldn't do or violates your privacy in some way that they shouldn't, like, there shouldn't be a different regulatory structure for that or an easier way to get away with that. And I think, like, it's the conversation, the other side has really been like, oh, the small banks need relief, And, there's a lot of good technical experts looking at, poking holes in what's true and what's not in that, in this room and otherwise. But I think we need to think about, what are you getting as a consumer? What kind of consumer protection are you getting? And is the system working? Does everyone get a fair shot there? I think we need to kind of flip that narrative around.
Okay.
Can I just want to, back to the small banks, I'll never forget the moment. I think it was summer of 2016. I was testifying before Senate Banking, and I think there was Community Bankers Association person on the panel, and they were saying, we need relief. And I just popped in to say, but I'm looking at the FDIC report now saying community banks have had the most profitable year in X number of years. And I think basically all the energy just fell out of her argument and she was quiet. And the guy from the large bank lobbying organization wrote me a note saying, thank you. And I'm thinking, okay, that's not my point here, but
Right.
yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think that there is a little bit of an anachronistic view of how, we're at a conference about populism, of how Democrats win in certain kinds of states, that the model for a long time was you be friendly to business, you be friendly in particular to the banks, and that's the way that you do it. And, I worked for a senator who every time he was up for re-election should have really been considered frontline, who has managed to win a number of re-elections in a really tough state, a red state, what is effectively now a Trump state, being really tough on Wall Street. He was viewed as the anomaly, not the way to do it. A number of the other senators who signed on to 2155, who actually helped water down and get concessions into Dodd-Frank in the first place, lost their re-elections. So what you see is there's deregulation that happens in service of those people getting reelected that will actually have a tangible impact on people's lives that will actually hurt people, and then they lose anyway, so it's not even necessarily a successful strategy. So I would just suggest maybe let's try the other way for a little bit, like actually helping people. Maybe you win, maybe you lose, but let's do the right thing. I think it's a winning strategy, but we'll see, and people won't get hurt in the process.
Right. Amanda, do you think staffing plays a role here too? Who's, not just staffing, but, who's coming in, right? Like the typical person doesn't call up their congressman or congresswoman and say, I want to talk about my bank, right? This just, maybe it happened in 2009, but generally it doesn't really happen. So how does that play out with terms of, who people on the Hill are talking to, and how does that affect their perceptions of what's really going on out there? And then in turn, how does that affect legislation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Brad spoke to this, but I think it really creates a mind warp situation for most members of Congress to spend, even the ones that don't accept corporate PAC money, which is an increasing number of at least House Democrats. You're spending upwards of 3 or 4 hours a day on the phone asking rich people for $500, $2,000 a time. And you need to have a concerted mindset where you need to affirmatively seek out opinions that will counterbalance those opinions that you're hearing on the phone all day long. And, meanwhile, there are very brilliant and well-intentioned early career people, probably 25 or 26 years old, covering everything from labor to environmental policy to capital markets regulation. And the incentive structure makes it such that there's just not enough hours in the day. So relying on whoever is present to give you information to inform your opinions becomes the crutch. So that, happens to be the people that are the most well-resourced that will ghostwrite the letters, ghostwrite the legislation, have the explainers be able to come in and help shape your worldview. So in order to kind of, and I'm not even talking about corruption or doing things for people that give you money. It's actually it's a softer version of that, of just who you're interacting with on a daily basis, what perspective informs the decisions you make, what problems you think are worthy of your attention or where you should turn your gaze. And if whole swaths of your constituents are outside of view, it distorts your perception of what a problem is that ought to be solved.
Okay. All right. I want to do a quick lightning round here, and then I want to move the conversation forward. It's November 2020, and a Democrat has retaken the White House. What's the first bit of legislation you'd want to put forward in 2021, and why for finance?
We started that end.
Yeah. Well, and
Strictly legislation.
yeah.
Okay.
Or regulation, by the way. It could be regulation.
Okay,
too.
I'm gonna go the regulatory route.
Go the regulatory route. Okay. I don't want to make this too hard for people.
Yeah,
And why why isn't it getting attention now, I should say?
sure. So I'm gonna say two things. So one is, I think, bank capital. I think, dollar for dollar, that's the most important change that we can make and raise capital requirements for the largest institutions in the country. Out of all the prudential regulatory standards that we have, capital is critically important. And I think around 2015 to 2017, there was a lot of research, a good body of research that came out that sort of identified what the socially optimal level of capital was. So I think bank capital. And then two, and it needs to be higher than even where we were in the 2016 status quo, and Trump regulators have now lowered it from that status quo. And then two is integrating climate change into everything we do at the financial regulatory agencies. Climate risk is a financial risk. It is a threat to financial stability. It is not, the left pushing social engineering on the Fed or the other financial regulators. It is real, and we need to take action now.
Are we going in order?
Yeah.
Well, I've already talked about the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which is usually my go-to. I'd also say the Veterans and Consumers Fair Credit Act, which is it's extending the Military Lending Act for all, but which also just translates into not being able to get loans over a 36% interest rate. And as a former legal aid attorney, I can tell you it would give me great relief that no one across the country could get, exploited for having to get a small dollar loan to fix their car or whatever, or their stove, and not get ripped off in that way. And so that would just bring a good law for everyone immediately, the regular person.
So since you started at the top and you're bringing from the bottom up, I'm going to also talk about grassroots level changes. So most of my changes relate to, not surprisingly, debt relief. So I would say on the executive order front, I favor executive orders that would eliminate student debt over a certain level. Also changing the bankruptcy code so that consumer debtors are treated the same as business debtors instead of this discrimination against consumers. So that would include ending the block on the ability for homeowners who are underwater on their mortgages to reduce the size of their outstanding principal balance to the value of the collateral. They should be able to do that just like wealthy people with second homes and boats and businesses. I would also do something similar with all student loans in the bankruptcy code to allow for student loans to be forgiven in bankruptcy. And I would try to make sure, we'd need a similar change in the tax code to make sure that debt forgiveness for student loans was not considered taxable income.
So I'll do one law and one rule. How about
Okay.
that? And
All right.
one for consumers and one for the banks. For the regulation, I would do Congressman Miller mentioned earlier the swaps push-out rule. There are ways to do that. They're purely regulatory. Let's do it. And the other is banning forced arbitration.
Okay. Why forced arbitration?
It proliferates all financial contracts. It's even, in employment contracts and in all sorts of other situations. It is really pernicious. It is nefarious. I started working on that issue back in 2007. I thought I was taking crazy pills because no one knew what it was. No one cared about it. I thought I was totally wrong. And all of the evidence in the ensuing decade has shown that's really harmful to every smaller party in a particular transaction that has that used against it. It is harmful to them, and it matters a lot in terms of power imbalances.
Okay.
Super wonky, but I would implode a lot of the process rules that govern Congress. CBO scoring is a joke. The Congressional Review Act is a joke. It's invisible handcuffs that constrain policymakers from doing anything meaningful. You spend $1 million helping homeless people get off the street. It costs $1 million, even though all the research suggests that aside from being the morally right thing to do, it pays for itself. And then meanwhile, CBO says deregulating banks up to $250 billion in assets is costless. And it's maddening, and a lot of work is being done to kind of rethink a lot of those process levers.
Okay. Why do we think that helping, and this is for the panel, one of the things that comes up over and over again is helping people is somehow a cost, but it's the old joke about, socialism for the rich and, capitalism for the poor, but helping out banks or, the financial sector is somehow growth, right? How do you change this mindset, right? Because in fact, what we know is, you give money to, when we talk about tax policy, right? You give money to people who don't have it, they'll actually spend it. How do we change this mindset? Because Jennifer and I were talking about this for a few minutes before the panel started, where people just seem to get stuck in this loop of, wait, we're giving something away. Okay, do you want to talk, Jennifer? Do you want to start?
So that was a private conversation, but thanks. No, I think this mindset comes up a lot in this kind of envy mode.
Right.
So people, when you talk about student loan debt forgiveness, you get some pushback saying, I paid for my scrimped and saved, and I paid for my college education or for my children's. But what these folks don't acknowledge is that, when I was a small child, you could still get a free college education, completely free in the California system. When they take stuff away from us, if we say, hey, you took that away, we're whiners. But the people who complain that we want to make it better for the next generation, they're not whiners, they're righteous. There was the GI Bill. I think my father bought his first home with, very low interest loan. There's a lot of stuff that the people today who don't want the next generation, who are being crushed under debt, whose wages have not kept up with inflation. Somehow we can't give them something to make, the American dream happen for them when they got all these goodies in their era. I think we have to be really clear about what that's about. Also, it's this kind of, that was one of the biggest problems in getting, although the House passed, lien stripping for underwater mortgages, the Senate wouldn't. And part of what was going on, we remember the Rick Santorum, raging speech at CNBC in Chicago. That's what started the Tea Party, because it was all about, look at your neighbor. Don't you want them to suffer because they have an extra bathroom in their home? And I'm like, what kind of person thinks that? But actually, a lot of people think that way. And we need to get them to understand a couple things, which is it benefits them. But what Helene also said to me at this conversation is, in the abstract, knowing that all, the rising tide will lift all boats, people don't like that any more than they like trickle down. Mm-hmm. So maybe some of these debt forgiveness bills should give a credit to people who've also paid off their debt. Unfortunately, the reality is people need to see something in it for them. And they really do, are really envious of their neighbors and don't want them to get something they didn't get.
Go ahead.
What?
Whoever wants to go.
You go.
My entire career before coming to AFR, I represented homeowners in foreclosure for most of it. And I'm also, we were talking earlier, the panelists, about where we're from. So I'm from the Midwest. My parents are Korean immigrants. I say all of this to say, people look at me and my family and they're like, I wrote a college essay about how I'm the manifestation of my parents' dream, home ownership and their oldest kid going to college, right? And I went to a private snooty school, so I kind of fit the mold. And people, would be like, oh, your parents worked really hard. My dad worked so hard that I called his store his house, and people thought my parents had marital problems. And so people love to be like, oh, your parents worked really hard. They came to the country legally, blah, blah, blah. and then they're like, why did you go around and, represent these deadbeats? Like, I'd get this question, lots of things about my clients. Are they deadbeats? They took out homes they shouldn't have never, like, forget that, no one checked their ability to repay. Like, they were being greedy. They bought too much house. And, there's so many stories, right? And we all know them in this room. I don't need to, like, belabor the fact, right? But the people who work 3 jobs and, oh, look, the economy crashed, so they lost all 3. Or, God forbid, someone got ill, or, all of that. I mean, my favorite story is these 2 siblings who fell behind on their mortgages because their sister fell into a coma and the brother took time off, and then someone had to take care of elderly dad in the process, right? And these are just stories that people in this room know, but I think it's just, that's reality. And I think there's a wanting to believe if I worked hard that other person is different from me somehow, and they're less worthy because my hard work paid it off for me. And I think it's just, we need to do so much more framing around some of that is the system benefits some people over others, and some of that is luck. But to be like, yes, your hard work paid off for you, but other people's hard work should pay off for them. And the system doesn't work that way. And the other thing I have to say is just racism, right? Like, well, I mean, that's a factor. And I can't, when it's people who look differently from you, I mean, that it's real. I think the comments I used to also get on my clients who were mostly, non-white, like, those people are different from us. And, being Asian American, that's also an interesting dynamic, I can tell you. But that's also just like, yeah, how do we treat people who don't look like us, and take that in every way, not just race?
Okay.
If
Go ahead.
One thing to that. We shouldn't discount the importance of elite rhetoric and elite framing, and their willingness to actually throw their weight and their authority behind things. Mm-hmm. They were willing to use the language of populism. We need to save the banks to save Main Street, when that was the proposition that was on the table. But then when it came to actually helping homeowners stay in their homes, right, they just kind of tucked-tailed and ran and didn't want to engage in that argument. They're willing to accept accusations of things like moral hazard and irresponsible borrowers. They didn't want to pitch that fight, and they didn't want to push back on it because it was easy. It's hard to fight back against powerful entrenched interests and to make that forceful case. It was easier to just sort of say, well, like, this is a political loser. Sorry, we can't do it. The will isn't there. I think elites need to do more to actually invest in those fights, and to not use Main Street as a shield for Wall Street when that's what needs to happen, and then just throw them away when they actually need some help. That comes from the top down, I think, as well.
Okay. Before I go to questions, I'll throw out one thing there. Open up for a moment. One thing that was doing that quite effectively for a time was the CFPB, right? The CFPB was really popular, and yet it somehow has been quite attacked recently. Why haven't we been able to mobilize more anger about this, or have we, and we're just not hearing it? And if anybody wants to talk about this. Linda has thoughts, I can see.
I think there should be more anger than there is, but I think it's sort of kind of tying into what we were talking about earlier. There's a lot of like things that CFPB's rules maybe aren't as hard to comprehend as derivatives and swaps, but they're also things that if you're going about your normal day, you're not really thinking about, and they're just also flooding the zone with things. And I think it's a noise issue. Like, there's a lot going on that's really bad right now, both in terms of the financial stuff and also just in the country. And I think that's a lot of it. I think there should be more anger, because this is the stuff that I think everything we're talking about affects regular people, but how easily it is to connect is I mean, this stuff is right there. So there should be more anger, and we're continuing to work on it. But I think people are overwhelmed and tired. It all connects to what we were talking about earlier.
Amanda, do you want to go? Yeah.
I'd just say there's also been a concerted campaign, not only to make the Bureau ineffective or work on behalf of moneyed interest, but to also make it boring and unknown. So they redesigned their logo. They tried to change their name, instead of the CFPB, the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. And they really retrenched from any public awareness campaigns. So making it invisible is a feature, not a bug, of the current team. They're there's been a lot of actual money spent and time spent thinking about this.
On that last point, just piggyback on that. Congressional Republicans used to attack them all the time for their marketing budget. And I would be sitting there in congressional briefings where a staffer would come in and they would say, so we went on your website and saw your job postings. Why are you paying this like PR person, this offering to pay them this much money? Why do you have like 4 social media postings there? Like, how does that help consumers? And I think it's because they get like,
Right.
if this thing has a high profile and people see it doing good things, they might actually like it, and then we can't take it away. So
Right.
don't underestimate the strategic importance of that.
Go ahead.
You know, Amanda talked a bit about this problem of cognitive capture, where you don't realize. But what we're talking about here is actual capture. I mean, whether it's the CFPB or the EPA. I mean, the purpose here is to put, you know, to put people in charge of these important agencies who are going to undermine their purposes. And this is the same thing. And I think the other thing is, you know, we have an example of excellence and competence in an agency, something we should like. I mean, this is an agency who in its first 6 years returned over $12 billion to consumers. That should be a good thing. And that's why they're trying to run it into the ground.
Okay, so that brings me to another point that I wanted to raise, which is, you know, how do you get, you know, people in who will actually do that? How do you, if you have a Democratic administration come 2021, get people? The CFPB was quite good. On the other hand, we all know that, you know, there was a lot of fighting about the CFPB before it was established, and that even in Congress, there were people, Democrats, who were less supportive, shall I say, about things like payday loan regulation. How do you get people in who will support the mission? How do you tell who's, quote, good, who's not good? Go ahead, Jen. Yeah.
I mean, I'd be happy to do it, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, you know, fights will happen. There's a lot at stake here. So you just win the fights.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be avoiding conflict when we're talking about billions of dollars in people's lives is not the goal. The goal is to help people and win the fights through competence, through better reasoning, and through persuasion, and ultimately, sadly, just through having the power.
Yeah, and I think, look, our party has been willing to expend the political cost and go to the mat on certain fights. Like, we pick and choose what we want to fight about. And so I think directing that energy and that will to win and to suffer some costs towards the regulatory agencies on this issue where there's so much broad authority and levers that can be pulled to accomplish 60, 70, 80% of what we could accomplish through large scale legislation. I think we just need to make that commitment and then organize folks to be showing up at hearing rooms for the vice chairman for supervision of the Fed nomination hearing, and to actually care about these nominations that may have weird titles that people haven't thought about before, but direct their energy in that way.
And I'd say just to like look further into the resumes of who's getting these up. I mean, and push, right? Like that's, I feel like lots of times campaigns are around issues, right? And that's very, very important. But you know, let's get more of us into that conversation about who's, and it's not, you know, being a Democrat is something, and then let's, you know, where do you come from? What do you stand for? What does your career stand for? What do your public statements stand for? Let's dig into that more. And I know there are people in this room who are doing that, but I think we just need more and more of that until it's actually large enough to make a difference.
Anybody else? I said I wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to open it up for questions. And if people don't, there's lots of them. Okay, so we're going to go through. I was going to say, if not, I have more. Go ahead. You had your hand up first. Yes.
So my name is Carter Doherty with American Financial Reform. I was a little bit surprised early in the conversation when you were talking about how financial regulation, financial reform gets sort of immersed in this technical jargon, and therefore it's hard to rally the public behind it. That overwhelmingly, I would argue, has not been the problem in the last 3 years. The problem in the last 3 years is that the house is on fire, and there are so many other things going on. And, you know, from a moral standpoint, raising hell about putting kids in cages probably ranks higher than swaps pushing. Just venture that as a, you know, purely values thing. And I think you can rally people effectively, and I think the debate around the Crapo bill showed that, because, you know, we couldn't stop it. We didn't change the election outcome. But it made it so painful that even Republican senators after was like, we're done. There is no follow-up to the trade law because that was what the industry really wanted. And I would just end this comment on a sort of down note that this problem would return with a vengeance if there's a Democrat in the White House and Democrats have control of both chambers of Congress because the agenda is so full. And frankly, even as a guy who works for Americans for Financial Reform, if you told me that the priority in the next Congress has to be democracy reform and ensuring, a sensible decision-making process, democratic decision-making process, I would be hard put to disagree with you and say you need to pass the Stop Wall Street Movement. I know walking and chewing gum at the same time is possible, but when you're dealing with the most powerful industry in the world, it's certainly going to be a challenge.
Go.
I will just say that on the rhetorical point, opposition could have been built larger and more effective, I think, if there weren't so much policing around rhetoric. I think at least internally, there were members of Congress making certain arguments and using certain language that were then getting policed for, like, you said this is about Wall Street, but like my bank isn't on Wall Street, it's on like West 51st Street or something. and there is fear around, there are, and there was like a fact sheet put out about all the like misleading things you said because you said it was 49 and really it was 48. There is a way in which some of these efforts could be more successful, but they get the legs cut out from under them by people saying you're flattening, you're using a blanket term. People worried about like the Washington Post, no offense, like fact checking them and saying that, it's 7 Pinocchios. There are ways in which some of the opposition could be more effective. It could be built more and would make the issues more easily understood when there's a bill like that on the floor that then get pre-butted before you even get there because members don't want to offend their friends by using the wrong kind of language and accusing them of untoward things. So I think, yes, there are different sets of priorities for different groups, but that energy and attention can be repositioned when something like this is on the floor and a movement is building that then get cut off at the knees because there is this like need to use the most accurate language and be collegial within the members of the party.
Jen wants to go.
So, Carter, I want to cheer you up and make a contrary argument that I actually may believe as I'm saying it, which is this. Because on the front lines, folks are going to be heavily focused on democracy reform and kind of restoring norms, it will be easy for the House and Senate banking committees to get these kinds of restoration of the rollbacks and move forward on bank reform because no one's going to be really paying that much attention or objecting. That would be my argument.
Okay, and I'm just going to say one thing. I see these things as very intimately and intricately related, which is that, borderline fascism, which is what we semi have at the moment, actually comes out of what we're talking about on this panel. And the trick is to actually get the connection into the public and make the public make the connection. And I see you right there. Go for it.
Thanks. So I want to offer an alternative theory to what you guys are dealing with. I suspect some of you will know what it is. So my sense is that the political problem that people are trying to deal with but are dancing around is that the Democratic Party is run by dumb, corrupt thieves. And I think it's really obvious. I think we saw it during the financial crisis. I think we saw it, they couldn't count the votes in Iowa. I think you see, it's just embarrassing. And I'm sorry, but a relatively unimportant consumer protection agency that got a little bit of money for consumers and was super bureaucratic is not an answer. And just kind of letting this problem fester without talking about it strikes me as opening a big political opportunity to a whole series of bad actors, but it also seems like it limits the capacity to actually build strength around the things that consumer protection advocates actually care about. So I want to put that to you and sort of, how do you respond to that sort of framework?
Anybody? Go.
I mean, I think that's consistent with what I said earlier about what the party thinks a successful member, particularly a member in a swing state, looks like. Is there was a model of the Democratic Party that was like the Bob Rubin, if we're friendly to Wall Street here, we throw a few bones over here, then that's the way to win. And that we need to make the party see that is the populist model that is actually the winner nationwide. which means we need to win in the first place and take it over and then reposition the party.
Go ahead.
Imagine, this sort of this conference is about like what the populist policies could be. Imagine, Sanders or Warren presidency, you each are on a high-powered bank regulator or something like that. What are the 1, 2 things that you would do to, address, the problems in the banking and financial sector? To me, I think that's kind of, I'd like to know, the 1, 2, 3 things that you would do right away from an executive authority standpoint. I mean, the congressional thing, I mean, you could debate how hard that is, but executive authority is.
Anybody want to take it? Go.
I can give my quick rapid fire list of
Okay.
things. So one is higher, like I mentioned earlier, higher capital relative to where we were in 2016. So first undoing Trump and then going significantly higher than that. Substantially stronger stress testing. There are plenty of ideas on how to do that, and I'm happy to talk about specifics if anyone's interested. Rethinking liquidity requirements. I think we actually got them a little bit wrong after the financial crisis. We need to better restructure the asset liability mismatch and not just have banks hold a bunch of liquid assets for the stressed outflows. Then FSOC, SIFI designations. I think that is going to be one of the most difficult things we do. We need to get 7 votes on FSOC to designate large, complex, interconnected insurance companies, asset management firms, highly leveraged hedge funds, and put them under the prudential regulatory framework.
I think as far as consumer protection goes, I want to focus on staffing at regulators for a minute. And, in your hypothetical, I guess all of us would have a nice high position. So that's one good person wherever our respective dream places might be. But also just making sure there's, more vetting of staff, having more staff that come from the populace, doing advocacy work, doing whatever work they're doing. Making sure that there's resources dedicated to supervision and enforcement of financial institutions across the board that's real and meaningful, and that, the CFPB is, as we discussed before, was doing that really well before all of this, has happened in the last few years. But also, what real accountability looks like, and that means enforcement. That means consequences, good and bad. And I think there's a lot more staffing and resources that could be devoted to that to make that a reality, and making sure that there's the will behind it to carry that forward.
I'll just say that I wrote something for the American Prospects Day 1 agenda about this.
Okay.
So go to their website, prospect.org. There's a whole bunch of examples of things that could be done.
Okay.
Like 12 of them or something.
Anyone else or other questions? Or if anybody else on the panel wants to say something? Okay, go ahead.
David Beck with Self-Help in North Carolina. And I'm curious, you talk about populism, and maybe I missed the very beginning, but how do you, my idea of populism is thinking about Williams, Jennings Bryan, and sort of their positive connotations and negative connotations. And I think Democrats shy away from it a lot because of the negative connotations, when obviously now you've got a president who essentially is a populist or pro-populist, whatever. But I'm curious for y'all to have any opinions about defining populism, or how you think it should be positioned in a way that's attractive for Democrats?
Anybody? Linda? Does anybody want to try this?
I think maybe my short answer is folks that are willing to stand up to concentrated power wherever it may lie. So whether that's private power, standing up to Wall Street, public power, standing up to the folks in the political sphere, standing in your way to get democracy reform, that's sort of the populism as I see it.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, on the point about sort of left-right and the way that it has certain negative connotations, I think that's our own fault. If we don't actually model a positive vision of what populism can look like, it is vulnerable to the conception and, frankly, I think the specious argument that it is only racial grievance tied to, a larger social safety net and trade protectionism. I think it's no coincidence that Trump says, like, I want to protect and expand Social Security. I hate Wall Street and I won't be beholden to them. Like, those are popular positions, and that paired with something more of a liberatory agenda is the sort of thing we ought to be putting forward to counter his what is effectively, like, what he has shown in practice is he talks about that stuff because it's popular and then does the nationalism side of it, and you don't get the other part of it. If we model all of what populism could be in a positive way, then we will win.
Yeah, I would just add that Trump has a unique ability to say something like that and then do the complete opposite and
Yeah.
somehow get away with it,
Yeah.
which I think makes everybody kind of crazy. It's gaslighting on some, Uber level, basically. Other questions, because we have about 3 minutes left, so I probably have time for one or two more. Go ahead.
Is Mike Bloomberg an oligarch? Maybe I should ask the media panel, but he also is in the financial services industry.
Who wants to go?
Yeah.
I wasn't.
Joe.
So I don't know enough about his how he made his money because he hasn't released his tax returns. So it's hard for me. It would be hard for me to judge whether he has done anything unlawful.
I should actually step back. I don't know what is an oligarch.
What is an oligarch? I don't know. What do you think an oligarch is?
I
To me, I mean, there's a wonderful book that I'm reading now by called American Oligarchs by Andrea Bernstein. I don't know if you know her work. She has the Trump Inc. podcast. And so in her book, American Oligarchs, she's focusing on the Trump family and the Kushner family. And although she has not provided a definition of oligarch, what I derive from reading this book is it's extremely wealthy and powerful families who have cut corners in the law and been fortunate enough. Well, in some cases, as in case of Jared's father, he did serve time in federal prison for witness tampering and other things. I think folks maybe know that story. But this idea of people who evade the law in order to become wealthy. I mean, I think oligarch has a different term internationally. We often associate it with sort of utterly corrupt billionaires, let's say in Russia, who are somehow whose wealth is interlaced with government power. I'm going to use it more broadly to say I would say it would be extremely wealthy people who use their power and wealth to gain more power and wealth and evade laws, particularly criminal laws. So I would not, based on that definition, I would absolutely not call him an oligarch.
Guys, thank you all.